All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Raymond Camden, and I am a lead developer for Here Technologies. We do a bunch of stuff involving location and mapping, and nothing I'm talking about today, but if you have any questions about that, certainly feel free to reach out to me. I blog at raymondcamden.com, and I tweet at Raymond Camden. My blog has a contact form, and my DMs are open on Twitter. So if you have any questions about what I'm talking about today, the JAMStack in general, anything involving technology, Star Wars, or cats, please reach out. I enjoy answering questions. I like to help other people, so I definitely don't mind you reaching out with anything you may have in mind. I'll also point out that the slide deck and the demos are all up on GitHub. I'll be sharing this URL a couple times, but if you want to download the assets and play with them yourself, you certainly can. Now, before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping to kind of let you know what we'll be working with. So, in terms of the tools that I will be using, I am using vue.js, and I am using Eleventy, and primarily using Netlify. I want to be absolutely clear that the nature of this talk does not require Vue, does not require Eleventy, does not require Netlify. These are all tools that I'm pretty familiar with and that I enjoy using, but you can absolutely use other front-end frameworks and other static site generators and other hosting providers as well. Again, I'm using what I'm comfortable with and what makes sense to me. But again, everything that I'm talking about today, you could definitely use your favorite tool, and I recommend that you do that. And again, the repository for everything that I'm showing today is under my main GitHub account, and it's API-integration-JAMStack. So, what is this particular talk about? So what we call JAMStack has kind of gone through a couple different iterations. Certainly now it's actually lowercase, not uppercase like I have it on Stack there. And before that, we kind of referred to it as static site generators. And really, it's a way to describe a new way of building websites. And part of that way, part of that method of creating a end result website relies on the A part of the JAMStack, which is for APIs. When we talk about moving from a traditional app server, and I come from a history of using app servers, and in my case it was Cold Fusion. I was used to having on my server essentially a tool set that allowed me to do anything at all that I needed. Switching to the JAMStack and switching to static sites, one of the kind of scary things was that I no longer had that tool set. Now, luckily, there are a lot of APIs out there, and essentially these allow us then to either enable us to build our site in general or enhance our site. And that's a pretty important thing to kind of keep in mind, is that whenever we talk about adding APIs to the JAMStack, it could be for features that are absolutely required, where if for some reason this API is down, then you're kind of stuck. Or it could be an enhancement. So if I'm using an API, for example, to load the products for my e-commerce site, that's crucial. You kind of have to have that. If I'm using an API to talk about or show the current weather at my store, for example, that's an enhancement. And if that's not working, then that's totally fine. And we'll kind of talk about those ideas of, is it required, is it optional? We'll talk about that in this presentation. We'll talk about ways to handle when things go wrong. Speaking of that, the general game plan of how I'm approaching this topic, we're going to talk first about using APIs and just client-side JavaScript, which is, as you could probably imagine, kind of something we've been doing for a very long time. Talking about using API proxies I'm also going to talk about using APIs in the build process, and that's kind of a crucial part in the JAMStack. And then we're going to talk about generating an API, and that's in quotes for a reason. And then we'll kind of wrap up talking about error mitigation and essentially what to happen when things go wrong. Now I'll say, one of the reasons I love the JAMStack is that there's kind of less moving parts, but the more services you use, the more that you may rely on things that are out of your control. So, it's something that you have to keep in mind as well. So let's talk about APIs on the client. So to be clear, I'm literally just talking about, regular HTTP calls being made from JavaScript. And this is absolutely not just a JAMStack type thing, but when we're talking about leaving an app server behind, this is one way that we can get functionality back into our system, back into our website. Now, for the most part, this just works. I'm going to point out a couple of things I ran into in the JAMStack involving client-side JavaScript, but in general, things will just work. In general. So let's talk about a demo. So I'm going to get my editor open here. And again, don't forget, I'm using vue.js. I'm using 11e. That's 100% optional, not required. So for my first site using 11e, I have a index.markdown file where I'm going to use some client-side JavaScript. In this case, I'm calling a file js/app.js that's going to hit an API and get my data. I'm going to run this real quick. See the demo 1, 11e serve. Before I show more code, I'd like to show it actually working. All right, localhost 8080. So we will pop in there real quick, and we will see, there we go. We see Star Wars movies along with when they were released. I'll go back to my code, and the JavaScript is literally just using a fetch call to hit that back-end API and then show it. Again, nothing at all that is special about this or different or unique. I absolutely could be using this in a Node.js site or PHP, .NET, etc. I did actually run into a problem with 11e that may not apply to your static site generator, but one of the features it has is that when you write down, when you use markdown files, it actually lets you employ a template language parser with markdown. So you can actually kind of have server-side, at least during generation, server-side variables and things like that. The default language it uses is Liquid. And guess what? The syntax is the exact same as Markdown. So the first time I ran this, 11e actually tried to parse the Vue code. Luckily, that's super easy to fix. In the 11e config file, I basically just turned that feature off. And literally, that was it. So that's something in particular to 11e, and the fact that I used the vue.js as well may not happen to you at all if you're using a different generator and a different front-end technology. I have another API in use here on my contact page, and again, I'll run this, and then I'll show you the code behind it, where I have a very boring contact form. I'm Raymond Camden, that's my email address, and I'll just do like that, hit send, and boom, your awesome form was submitted. By the way, don't use alert statements. That was just a quick and easy fix. And all I'm doing here is just showing, again, I'm using Vue, but in this case, I'm using FormSpree. That is a form processor. It's really useful for the JAMStack because it handles that thing of I need to submit a form and get the data. They have both a point your form tag at a solution as well as a way to use it via JavaScript, which is what I'm doing here. And again, I could make this a little bit more complex. I can actually have form validation in there as well if I wanted. But I just wanted to show, kind of a simple example. And again, I'm using these client-side APIs. There's nothing special about it in the JAMStack except for the small issue I ran into with 11e and Vue. So how about the cons? So the big one is going to be CORS. That's cross-origin resource sharing. By default, your browser cannot make a JavaScript request to another server's API unless that API specifically uses a header that says that's allowed. All right. Without CORS, when you hit that API, you're going to get an error in the console. Now, many sites now allow CORS, but some APIs do not. It's really kind of hit or miss, and check the documentation, and hopefully they actually document if they do. Not all of them documented, and you won't know it until you actually try to hit it. And the other big issue is that the API has to either have an anonymous access or provide a key that's safe to use. Now, what do I mean by that? If we look back at my code, for example, when I had the Star Wars API, if they required me to pass a key, I'd have to have that in my source code. And that means anyone could take that key and use it. And if I'm paying per use, or if I have a quota, that can end up screwing me over. Now, one nice things that that various API providers are doing, my company here, for example, will do this. When you generate a key, you can also say, hey, this key only works on these domains. If you use that feature and specify, your particular website, then you don't have to worry about it. If someone takes your key and tries to use it on their domain, it will be blocked. The other issue is that you can't modify the data, and by that, what I mean is, yes, I can pick what I want to show. So on my Star Wars API page, if we go back to that, you'll see I show the film title and I show the film release date. But they actually return a heck of a lot of data. And if I reload this with my DevTools, we could see the call to films, and it's kind of big. We see we have all this data. Let me expand this. We have characters, which is a lot of data. We have edited, we have plant. Basically, we have a lot of data. And I made my user, in this case me, I made them download all that just to show 2 items. So while I can certainly modify or pick and choose what they show, I still had to kind of take what the API gave me and render that. So that's where the next feature comes in really handy, and that's API proxies. Now, when we talk about this, essentially we're talking about adding a midpoint. So instead of me going directly to the Star Wars API, for example, instead I'm going to hit something in between that will fetch the data. Now, this is typically a really good use case for doing serverless. And you could do things like hide your keys, because my JavaScript will hit the endpoint, will hit the the midpoint serverless function. That will then make the secure call with the key to the remote service. You can also do things like shape the results. So Star Wars API is returning a lot of data I don't need, and I'm making my client, making my users get that data. Well, with a serverless function, I can only return what they actually need. Even cooler, you could switch providers. So in the case of the Star Wars API, actually they switched the domain. So I think the old one got abandoned, someone else took it over. If I'm using a serverless function to handle those calls, I could literally just change the URL, and none of my front-end code has to worry about it. Another example of that could be I'm getting weather data, for example, and my provider decides to raise the rates and charge me a lot more money. I could instead switch to a different provider who has better terms, and then make sure that the result weather information matches what my client-side JavaScript needs, and then I'm just done. And you can also do things like add caching, right? So if I'm getting 500 page views per hour, there's really no need to check the weather 500 times in an hour. You can do it once or twice instead. So as a demo, I'm going to show 2 of them. The first one I'm going to show, let me close some stuff down here. We're going to go in demo 2. And for this one, I still have 11e in play, and I'm still using a JavaScript file. But if we look at that, this is actually hitting a local URL, /API/films. And what I did is I used the Vercel to set up a serverless function. And I could see that in my API folder. I could see it in films.js. This is actually running on Vercel serverless platform. I think they just wrap Amazon, Lambda. I don't have to worry about it. But what's nice is that I actually went in here and I shaped the result a bit and only returned the title, release date, and director. And by the way, I could do more too. Like, I don't necessarily like the underscore. If I wanted to, I could get rid of that underscore and make it look the way I like. So if we go into demo 2, click cd demo 2, and Vercel dev, this will fire up Vercel's local dev environment and give me a port to hit, which I believe will be 3000. And we'll go here, and it's really going to be the exact same data, 3000, but to my end user, all they saw was a hit to a local resource, a hit to films. The result data is a lot smaller. I'm not making my client download as much data. And again, if I want to really mess with how this looks, I have the opportunity to go in there and change the shape and do kind of crazy stuff as well. So this, it's a great example, I think. I'm going to kill it though, and I'm going to show one more example that is specific to Netlify. So I'm going to go into demo 3, and I'm going to run this, and then I'll show you what I'm doing. So we'll let Netlify dev start up, and it is localhost 888. All right, so again, same data, but I want to go into my network tab, and we're going to look at the call to films, and you could see, now I'm not doing any shaping here at all, but I have my data. But note that when we look at the request, it was to /APIs/film. So Netlify supports serverless functions as well. Is that what I did? No, I didn't. What I did instead, I'll open up demo 3, is I actually used a redirect. And so Netlify, they support redirects in general, where I can say any request to X goes to Y instead. Typically, you will actually see it in browser DevTools. However, when I specify a redirect and specify status code of 200, Netlify will actually hide that redirect for me. So basically, on my site, the JavaScript hit /API/films, Netlify recognized that that's actually a redirect, but it went the extra step to actually hide that redirect as well. And if I were to go in here, I could definitely have a access key, for example, that would be hidden from the browser, but that would still be passed along in the back end by Netlify to allow me to use a secure, /lockdown API without sharing a key. Again, Netlify absolutely does support serverless functions, and if I did want to do more work on, shaping that data, like I did on the Vercel side, that would be an option as well. But if I need the, 2 seconds of work to hide a key, this is all that I need to do. I think that's really darn slick. So going back to my slide deck, in terms of cons, there's not really that many. I mean, you have to write code maybe. For the Netlify one, I wrote a file, but I wouldn't necessarily call that writing a lot of code. But you do have to write something. The other thing is that, you may need another service. So Netlify and Vercel both have serverless baked in. And again, I believe they're both wrapping Lambda. I don't really care per se. If you are using a hosting provider that doesn't kind of have that baked in, and you want to use a serverless API proxy, then you have to add that service to your tech stack. And so you have to be worried about it and concerned about it. That's why I really like Netlify and Vercel, is that they allow me to kind of still work within my one website have my static site generator files, have my serverless files all within one folder, and kind of have it all self-contained. So now let's talk about using the build process. And what do I mean by that is essentially what happens when your site is generated. If you're using a static site generator, then you know that when you work locally, it typically sets up a little server and you write your code and you reload and all that, and it's good to go. However, when you go to production, it's a one-time process. So it does what it needs to do. It takes your markdown, your other files, it converts it to HTML, and it just spits out flat files. This happens in a variety of different ways. It could be a GitHub commit. So for example, on my blog, when I write a new blog entry, it's a file, I commit it to GitHub, Netlify recognizes the commit and then runs my particular process. Netlify and other services also typically allow you to expose a particular URL. And that URL, if you hit it, will then trigger a build to fire off. Now this particular scenario, this particular way of hitting APIs is great for data that doesn't change often. And I put often in quotes because it really depends. So for example, imagine you have products, things that you sell. You probably aren't adding products very often. You may, however, change shipping times or availability. Well, if you think about it, that may change, let's say, 10 times a day. Well, you could literally rebuild your site 10 times. If your site builds in less than 30 seconds, and you're using a service like Netlify or Vercel, you can absolutely run that many hits per day and not even think about them. And then your static website is updated again every time those products, their shipping dates change and stuff like that. So to me, it's still static. My data is not changing often, but it's okay if I still run it 10 to 20 times a day. For Star Wars films, for example, that's once every couple of years, right? So I could do that daily or even monthly and be covered. And because I use a service that has a URL trigger, if I know, for example, that one is coming up December 25th, for example, I could schedule a rebuild for that particular time. The options that you would do with this will depend on your platform and your static site generator. So as a demo, I'm going to show demo 4. Let's close all this junk and take a look at demo 4. And what I'm doing here is essentially using a build script. I wrote a little Node.js script, and what it's going to do pretty much the same thing I have been doing, call the Star Wars API and get the information back. But what I'm doing is I'm getting that data, I'm writing out some HTML, and I'm literally reading in a file and writing to it. In this case, my markdown file. I have a field there called film data, and if we go back to my build script, I'm literally replacing that with my HTML. And what this means is that when my static site is built, I tell Netlify or Vercel or whatever, run this build script, and then 11D takes over and does what it needs to do, in this case, converting one markdown file. Now I do have this up and running. Let me copy the URL over here. I will show it running. This doesn't work locally too well. It can work. I had some trouble, but don't worry about it. It does work. But this is my live version where if I triggered a new build, it would hit the API, call it again, get that data, write it out. But right now, when I'm hitting this page, this is not using JavaScript at all. So it's extremely lightweight, extremely quick. Now another thing you could do, and this is specific to 11D, but other static site generators may have it as well. Let me close stuff up here. They allow you to specify site-wide data that gets run at build time. For 11D, that's in a folder called _data. And again, I'm doing a fetch call to that same API endpoint. But in this case, 11D handles running this when it's building. I named my file films.js, and 11D makes that available as a variable called films. I go in my index file and I can access this. This means that it's done at build time. I have the Star Wars data, but again, no JavaScript being run at all. And I'm not even going to bother running this because I have the output right here. And you can see it's a flat file, no JavaScript. And there are my files. Alright, so that's the build process. One more thing I want to point out, and I will just share the blog post because we're a bit short on time, but you can mix and match. So let me actually show this demo real quick. So this is a static website built using 11y, and on the back end it's using FaunaDB to get information about products. It does this at build time. So the alpha to zeta happened at build time, and I can click and see details. And I'm not sure if you saw, but right there in availability, if I reload, it says fetching for like a split second. So what I did is I made the products happen at build time, and then I had the availability for shipping actually be a on-demand call. So it's still like products data, but I use partly static and partly dynamic because availability is changing often. So I actually have a blog post, and you can get the link from this slide deck where I go real deep into talking about FaunaDB and 11y, and showing this kind of mishmash example of doing it both at build time and in client-side JavaScript. Blog post covers it. I also have all the source code available for you to play with at your leisure. Alright, so in terms of cons, well, it's static. Again, my products, using the last example, would not be dynamic when every user hits the page. But again, that's alright. I know my product. So, I know that, as my company, we add products only once a year. So I can handle that. So let's talk quickly about generating an API. And I put that in quotes because it's kind of loose. Now, if you have a serverless endpoint, and again, Netlify, Vercel, or I can use a third-party service, if you have that, then you can do anything. So you can have an API endpoint that responds to calls, does filtering, pagination, etc. I'm talking more about generating static data that's computer readable. And all I mean by that is using JSON, XML, HTML, plain text, etc. It's essentially a read-only API. Now, you could absolutely argue, well, if it's read-only, it's not an API. If I can't pass a parameter to filter it in, it's not an API. And you would be right. However, if on your JAMStack site you want to take your data and make it consumable by a computer, this may absolutely be a solution for you that works well. So I have a demo in demo 6, and I'm going to run the demo and show you the output, and then show you how I did it. And if we go to, let me look real quick again, 8080, got too many demos open. We'll close this one, go to 8080. So this is my home page. I have different products. And each of these I can click and get more details on. But what's cool is that I also built products.json. So this is a machine-readable version of my information. And I even built a second endpoint, cheap products.json. The same thing, but only shows products that are below a certain price threshold. And all I did in 11y is build a liquid file, essentially a template, where I output my products data that came from, again, a feature of 11y, being able to create site-wide data. In this case, it's just a hard-coded JSON file, but it could be an API call as well. So to get all of my products out, I literally just kind of echo the information. My cheap product one has a little bit of logic in it. I'm using EJS in this case, where I filter by a particular threshold. So yes, it's an API. It's not a very powerful API, but it serves the purpose. Again, not a real API, but it may be enough for you. Now, in terms of error mitigation, you kind of have two things to think about. The first thing is obviously your code. All of my API calls, I didn't do try catch anywhere. I absolutely could have. That particular mitigation is no different than just doing client-side JavaScript in general or even Node.js code in general. You certainly could do try catch. That part is easy. Second part is not so easy. So you have to figure out how you want to handle it. And that kind of comes back to, is my code or is my data, is my API call, is it crucial? Is it must-have? And if so, then on my homepage, do I just show a message saying, I'm sorry, we can't sell products today? Or is it optional, where if the weather report doesn't come in, I just don't show anything at all? That is something that you have to figure out based on which particular API you're using. If you think about the contact form that I showed at the very beginning, I could have said something where if that call failed, I could have told the user, hey, I'm sorry, I couldn't submit your form. Here's our email address. Please use this instead. I'm sorry, yada, yada, yada. So again, you have options, but what you do is going to be based on, the API, its data, and how important it is to you. So just a couple of quick resources. This entire slide deck / presentation was based on a blog post I wrote a little while ago. This link will take you to that, so it's kind of like the book form of this. And I want to point out that my good friend Brian Rinaldi helps manage a newsletter all about the JAMStack called JAMStack that I think is really, really good and that you should sign up for. And at this point, we go out to questions, and I will say again, my Twitter DMs are open, so definitely feel free to reach out. Thank you for listening. I really, really appreciate your time and attention.